Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you, Leah, for organizing this. I'm really thankful to be in this beautiful old state house. I was reading up on the history. It's just an incredible space, and I will have to tour around the museum after I get done with my little talk because it's such a valuable part of our history, and I know you all appreciate that. Leah's correct. I do hail from Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Although Central Arkansas is a little bit close to my heart, I am a graduate of Hendrix College and went there from 2000 to 2004, so that dates me a little bit. But we would come over to Little Rock once in a while just to go out to dinner and that sort of thing. I love this area and I love the state of Arkansas. I live in Bella Vista now, right on the Missouri-Arkansas border, and I really just enjoy our history. Long story short, just a little bit about me. When I went to Hendrix, after I finished with Hendrix, I wasn't quite ready to go to grad school yet. So I joined the Peace Corps, did that for my time, and then after that I found that I was really interested in basically increasing my education, not with necessarily a master's degree, but with a culinary degree. And so I decided to go to the Maui Culinary Academy through the University of Hawaii. And I moved to Maui, and I kind of blitzed through my culinary classes in 1 year versus 2, being out of state tuition's a little high. So they allowed me to do that, and I quickly just kind of went through from beginning to advanced cooking classes. And when I returned from Maui after being there for a year and also writing for a food magazine while I was there, I noticed when I came back to Northwest Arkansas that it was beginning to change. Crystal Bridges hadn't yet opened and that sort of thing. So that's been a major catalyst in changing Northwest Arkansas as it is, including the food scene. But I started to look around and I noticed that nobody was writing down our history, especially in the Ozarks, that little Northwest Arkansas corner of the state. And I knew that we had a valuable history, but not just a valuable general history, a valuable culinary history. And being that I had had experience writing about food while I was in Maui as well as being a chef when I came back, I started to notice that if we didn't write down our culinary history and just our history and how it all intertwines, we would lose it. Because as you know, if you don't write something down, it sort of disappears. I worked for a museum not for a short time, but for a while, and I was approached by a publisher with an opportunity to carry a book in the shop, and I found myself saying, that book may not be a good fit, but you know what would be a good fit is if somebody would write about our Ozark food history. Why is there not a book about that? If you had that book, I would pick that up for the museum store and I would carry it. And she's like, oh, well, what would that entail? And I said, well, really, if you think about it, it should be structured this way. This is how you should lay out the chapters. These are the chefs and people you should interview. This is how you should write about it. This is what's significant. And I found myself mid-sentence going, light bulb, I could write the book. And I told her so. I told her that I could write the book. And she said, oh, could you? And I said, sure. And so I went home that night. I had a call the next day from the publisher asking me, so we've heard you want to write us a book. And I was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. Here, I have a full-time job. I'm about to get married, and here I have a book opportunity that I thought I wouldn't probably have till I retired. I always had that as a long-term goal for my life, write a book someday. Hendrix education kind of prepares you for a lot of writing. So I never assumed that it would happen so quickly, but I said okay, and I signed a contract, and I started writing a book. So I spent the past, year and a half, 2 years of my life working on and researching this book. I didn't just hole up in libraries. My husband allowed me to resign from my job so I could focus full-time on driving all around Northwest Arkansas, as far south as Altus, and of course to the northern and western borders, just to learn what our culinary culture is, not just from chefs that are current, but little country cooks that you'll never have heard of. Many of their recipes are in this book. They've never been written down, ever. They're those kind of recipes when you sit down at their kitchen table over a glass of sweet tea, they'll tell you, well, this cornbread had a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a handful of that, a cupful of that, and then when they say cupful, they don't mean a measuring cup, they mean a coffee cup. So taking the time to make those recipes in front of me and me measure each item and documenting them for the first time. You'll find over 50 heirloom recipes like that in my book, most of which took, quite a few hours to write down. Some of them go as far back as the 1800s. A lot of them are family heirloom recipes that have been passed down orally. But again, writing them down sort of preserves them, not just for that family, but for all of us. Because we are all Arkansans, we all love Arkansas, and our food culture, it really talks a lot to who we are as people. So I wanted to kind of share a few things from my book. I'll go through some pictures as well. These are basically the page proofs from my book. kind of walking you through the book. And then afterwards, if you do want to get a copy of my book, I do have them available for sale, and they're $22. And I have a card reader as well, as can take cash. So I thought I would start out just reading you a little bit from the first chapter, which is really a lot about the history of the Ozarks, and then kind of going into what how the chapters sort of break down. But just in a nutshell, I talk about the beginnings of the area and just how it evolved and how people first settled here, how people first came to the Ozarks, and then the food that evolved out of that settlement. And some of the food was already here, of course, wild game and fish being among those. So each of the chapters following that are going to delve into those different types of food. And then the final chapter talks about the future of Ozark cuisine, the future of, and it's really, much of it's very similar to Central Arkansas cuisine. There's a lot of commonalities. What is the future of our cuisine, and how can we save it? How can we save our farms? How can we save our land? Things that are worth saving. So I just wanted to read to you a little bit about that. And so as you can see, I'll be kind of scrolling through. So, all right, I love this picture. This is the White River. They've since, flooded part of it to make Beaver Lake. But I love this picture. It's probably from maybe the 40s. It's a woman hunting on her own. Just incredible. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the history. So you can even see down below, you can see the bluff line there, and you can see the rock formation in the water. Geographically, Northwest Arkansas is known for its extensive forests of hickory, oak, and pine, as well as highly abundant water resources, including streams, rivers, and reservoirs. Here, surface rocks are older than those exposed outside of the region. There might be some new information I'll share with you, hopefully. I'll get to share some new ideas, including dolomite and limestone, many of which house fossils from a time when the mountains were the guardians of an ancient inland sea. A lot of people maybe don't know that about Northwest Arkansas, but you can actually look at the rocks, even on the side of the road. If you see bluff lines that have been, kind of dynamited out to make roads, you can still see evidence of some fossils a lot of times in the rock. Geological evidence shows strata from these seas overlying the Ozarks from various periods of the Paleozoic era. So with the close of this era, seas receded, and over time erosion took its toll on the mountains, rounding them off to become what we call the Ozarks, or the Boston Mountains would also be part of that. So the first Arkansas hillbillies, or hill folk, found them to be a veritable never-never land of uncharted territory. I mean, think about it. A lot of people talk about the Ozark Mountains as if they're very tall mountains, but really they are very deep valleys that were carved out by erosion. It's just incredible. Some of these, to descend down off the mountains, you might go down 1,000 or 2,000 feet. It's really pretty incredible if you spend any time out in the wilderness, out in the Ozarks. The decay of these rock formations left behind rich sediments of limestone, dolomite, shale, loess, and alluvial deposits, creating a diverse Ozark soil. And this soil could grow corn, which was a staple crop for man and his animals during early settlement days, but really, there was enough already there. Limited early crop cultivation in the mountain valleys was supplemented by the many rewards of the Ozark forest. Wild game, fish, and the gathering of wild greens, nuts, fruits, and honey, and that's according to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, but even the forest's abundance of hardwoods was an immediate resource to build log cabins, which could be built just in not as many days because you didn't have to haul the wood for very long distances. So really, Ozark settlers could return home to a place where they had maybe found a wild turkey, or they'd hunted down some squirrel, and they could go ahead and start settlement early because of the abundance of wild game and fish and birds of the air that were available in the Ozarks, and still are. So it's pretty incredible. This kind of economy developed. It was a little bit of subsistence economy. People could trade and that sort of thing, but because of the valleys and the mountains, it was such a hard place to reach. The Ozarks actually literally became a natural backwater onto themselves, because if you think about you have Missouri to the north, you have Oklahoma or Indian Territory to the west, and then you have the swampland on the east side of Arkansas. So literally most people would, when traveling across the continent, would bypass Northwest Arkansas altogether and never go there. They would either go north through Missouri or down south, and so Northwest Arkansas was often skipped. And so for anyone to even settle there in the first place, they would have to be some very hardy people that could survive in the Ozark Mountains. Thinking about taking a wagon, and you might go in by foot or by horse, but you certainly wouldn't, there weren't the roads that the rest of the continent would have. Even this part of the continent was a little bit, as far as this part of central Arkansas was going to have roads, because if you have a a flatter land on which to build telegraph roads. I know even railroads arrived 50 years later than the rest of the country to Northwest Arkansas. So we were always just 50 years behind. Even whenever people had moved on to machines, Arkansas farmers were still behind the horse and plow. So you can see in this picture here, this is one of your typical Ozark families with field clearing tools. You can tell this family's pretty tough, and all the women and everybody, even the children, are going to be working. It required everyone to kind of carve out a life for yourself, and you had to be pretty dedicated to stick to it. So, you know, even with the swamplands on the eastern side, people eventually ended up settling in Arkansas. That's how we got a lot of our immigrant populations in Taneytown and Altus coming over from places like Sunnyside Plantation, where it wasn't a safe place for people to live along the Delta, because they needed a better place to live. So people came even there for a better life. Even though it was a hard place to farm, it was better than the malaria-ridden swamps of the eastern edge of Arkansas at the time. So really, yeah, stagecoaches coming, very few during the 1850s, and really not till the 1870s. It's just pretty incredible. I would say that a lot of people that wrote about Arkansas, and you guys here in Central Arkansas would deal with the same stereotype we've always had up in Northwest. You know, this whole idea of still hillbillies and backwoods folks, and it's just really because the people writing about us would come from the north, and they would come to visit, like Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, no relation to me. My last name's Rowe, but I will not claim him as one of my family members. You may know about him, but he came over. He would be the equivalent of our city slicker from up north to write about the Ozarks, and really didn't even know how to fire a gun. He was staying with people in a cabin, and they were giving him everything they had, you know, which wasn't necessarily much, and certainly not much for a northern man used to cream and butter at every breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But he wrote about them. You know, those kind of writings contributed to the Ozark hillbilly stereotype that may or may not be true. People know how to live out of the hills, but that doesn't mean they're not good folk. And so a lot of times greenhorns would come and visit, and they would report back a largely negative report about Arkansas. You know, journal entries were loaded with mention of a backward, semi-savage society populated by lazy, illiterate drunks. You know, even if you think about the Arkansas Traveler poem, I mean, when you think about it, it talks about the man asking for corn liquor, and he's, you know, him talking, and the man, you know, there in his shanty drinking moonshine, and, you know, those kind of things sort of contributed to it. But really, there's a lot of erroneous reports about us. You know, here's one from Schoolcraft that I just love. Every meal, where it be breakfast, dinner, or supper, consists of the worst possible coffee, indifferent, dirty, frothy-looking butter, black sugar or honey, as the case may be, a little bacon, or some sort of dried meat cooked, I do not know how, and as tough as leather and miserably made Indian cornbread. And another comment in a journal later lamented, the supper consisted of some pieces of dirty-looking fried pork, cornbread 8 days old, mixed up with lumps of dirt, I don't know where he got that, and coffee made of burnt acorns and maize. They had neither milk, sugar, nor butter. Well, of course not. We didn't have dairy cattle out there. You know, we would have had, but you know, the thing is that people were giving these men that came to visit and report back on them everything they had. Even if it wasn't much, they would share from their provisions. You know, they would, you know, pretty much give up the shirts off their back, you know, and that's kind of what people later on, more positive reports that developed. I just love to share these because I feel like this breaks the stereotype. Later on, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, after being stuck out in the Ozark wilderness and being saved by many a person from death and starvation, later commented on the White River Valley people, which would be, you know, the Ozark area. They are hardy, brave, independent people, frank and generous, further commenting that the Ozark men would form the most efficient military corps in frontier warfare which can possibly exist. So that's pretty high praise. I think he changed his tune. Later on, a German-born Friedrich Gierstocker found the Boston Mountains, which are outside of Fayetteville, to be the place of Rousseau's natural man, a solace from civilization. I've always felt that way about Arkansas. He lamented in 1842 upon his departure, of all I had seen in America, Arkansas was the one which pleased me most. I may perhaps never see it again, but I shall never forget the happy days I passed there, where many a true heart beats under a coarse frock or a leather hunting shirt. So that's just a little bit about the history. I just love that, you know. Really, Arkansans, we've got a lot to be proud of here. I remember when I first met my grandma from Colorado, she was surprised I wore shoes, and that is a legitimate truth. You know, we have a stereotype that extends beyond, but really when people come here, they don't really want to leave. We have a real hidden gem here, and I think that is true of the 1800s as well as true here now that we're in this new millennium, you know. Charles Monroe Wilson, who's since passed, but he was a U of A, I think he was a U of A professor in Fayetteville. He wrote about our food culture and our people, that these people are begotten not only by the earth, air, rain, and sunshine of this exceptional region, but by its ill-defended, almost miraculously enduring and invincible spirit. And I love to think about that. So when I tell people that I'm a hill folk or I'm a hillbilly from Arkansas, I say it with pride because, you know, there's something to be said about knowing how to live off the land. So the people like this here, they would have known how to live off the land, and I just want to share this fun picture with you. Some of these old pictures, I went digging through shoe boxes at museums for hours on end, finding pictures that had never been documented. I love this one because obviously, I mean, as you can tell, there's 2 photographers at this possum hunt. It must have been a pretty big deal to document the possum hunt, and that would be right around Northwest Arkansas. So if you want to ask me what is the Ozark cuisine, what is this that you've written about, Erin, I would say that Ozark cuisine or High South cuisine, which is a kind of a term being tossed around right now up in Northwest Arkansas. What is it? I would say that it is, I would like to read a quote here. Let me find it. It's basically everything that you see swimming through the air. Here we go. So to make High South food or Ozark food, here's what you start with. You start with the fresh spring water right out of the limestone, and you add in it all that grows near it. Persimmons, poke salad, watercress, dandelion weed, walnut and hickory trees with their nuts, lamb's quarter, wild morels, onions, and berries. And in the waters, in fresh springs, you're going to fish out our crawdads, our Ozark lobster, catfish, perch, crappie, some of the best trout you've ever tasted, bass, shad, frogs, and striper fish. And we're not the only ones competing for these food sources. You can find bigger game out there too, like wild bears that can still forage and find fish. Venison can still end up on the Ozark plate, along with possum, like these guys obviously are showing here with their hunting dogs, rabbit, squirrel, and hog. And it wasn't even uncommon, to even see bear on the menu. You know, oil trough where they used to ship off bear grease down the river, that has a name because of, you know, the abundance of people hunting bear. We were once the bear state. But we also are known for wild turkey. We have chicken now, quail, pheasant, and an occasional duck or goose. But I would like to tell you that we just have an abundance of food here, and it just was a beautiful place to live once you got here, once you got through the Ozark Mountains. So I thought I might just kind of take you through some of the chapters. Obviously, you've got corn, which I would start with talking about what is our history. I love this picture. It's kind of hilarious. This picture is Earl Hopping's 1-acre cornfield cultivated by a goat. I love it. People just, got along with whatever they had, but if you think about corn, it's not just corn on the cob we're talking about. We're talking about moonshine. We're talking about grits and hominy. I remember when I was researching the book, I went out to Cane Hill to the Harvest Festival out there, and Cane Hill is a small historic town where Arkansas's first college was and the first lady graduates. So happy Women's Day. We should celebrate Cane Hill because a lot of women went on to get a better education there. But whenever I went to the Cane Hill Harvest Festival, I noticed a lady stirring an old black kettle. And inside, I looked in there, and sure enough, it's hominy. And I'm like, are you doing that for a particular reason? She's like, well, I like to show people the old ways. So I put lye in here, and I'll run this through a lot of washes, and I'm going to basically show people how to make hominy. But I sure don't know how I'm going to can all this later on next week. And I said, do you need a hand? And she said, well, sure. So I showed up to a lady's house. We canned for 4 hours and did 40 jars of hominy, and her air conditioner had just went out. So you can imagine that giant pressure cooker, the middle of, September where it's still hot, canning. But I learned a lot about canning that day, and we would carry things out to her old cellar that she had dug out of a hill, and she still used it. I tell you, a country boy can survive, and a country woman too, because they canned everything, including the deer they hunted. So I felt like, man, if we ever have a situation where people can't get to the grocery store, they're gonna be okay. And they still use that. And it was probably from the early 1900s. It was a dugout cellar. It was just really impressive. So I do spend a lot of time talking about corn, how to make hominy, which I got her recipe, and also some of the best cornbread you'll ever find. The cornbread recipe alone in here was one of those sit through many gallons of sweet tea to get kind of recipes, but absolutely the best I've ever had. You got to have it in an iron skillet. As anybody that's a Southern cook knows, it makes all the difference, and have a really well seasoned skillet. And you know, good Southern cornbread doesn't have a lot of sugar or any at all often, and it's just it gets a nice brown crispy crust. So a lot of times when I'll do cooking classes or demos, I will make the cornbread just so people can see it come together, and that's one of my favorite things. It's one of my favorite recipes in the book as well, and it probably goes back to the 1920s, the original recipe. Who knows? It's one of those family ones passed down generation after generation. Another interesting recipe, just in case you're wanting to make your own, you may not. This is a legit moonshine recipe. Now, this moonshine recipe I got from an old timer. He would not let me put down his name because, you know, he has a reputation to keep. He's in his 90s, used to make it. It was an old recipe from the 20s, and I think he made it in the 30s when he had to get by. And so his employer was Mr. Cotton. We do not have a first name. It was all very incognito, but he told me many funny stories about making moonshine in the still out in the woods, and he's not something that he's proud of, but it's something he had to do to get by. He remembers being chased by a revenuer once that came upon the still and having to toss his white shoes, which would have given him off quickly. He'd toss them in the furnace when he got back to the house so they wouldn't be able to track him. Because those white shoes, those will stand out in a hurry if you're running through the woods with a revenuer on your tail. But if you do want to make your own, and I think that even in Missouri you can make your own, you just can't sell it. This is a legit recipe. 50 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of corn chops, and 35 gallons of water. And it talks about the whole process of it. I just thought it'd be kind of fun to include it. So moving on from corn, you know, you're definitely looking at pickling, of course. So, and I just love this, you know. Moonshine drank, rarely photographed, of course. You don't really see these very often in any old pictures, really. People weren't real proud of it, of course. And then this is a quote from the Arkansas Traveler about, "Have you any liquor? Nah, we ain't. The old hound got in the shanty and lapped it all up in the pot." I don't mean pot liquor, I mean corn liquor. "Have you got any whiskey?" "No, I drank the last of it this morning." That's from the Arkansas Traveler. And I don't know if Crystal Bridges still has the picture if Alice Walton bought the Arkansas Traveler, the original painting, but it was there for some time, which was really neat to go and see that. So, moving on to pickling and canning. I mean, not a lot of people can anymore these days, but they really should, even if you're just got to keep the end of the garden. So I literally had so much fun looking through old recipe books, finding old pickling and canning chapters, had to throw in a few good pictures. I'm really loving this one. This little gal, and the horse looks kind of happy to see the strawberries. People probably would have also canned strawberries if they, you know, did strawberry jam and that sort of thing. And we had strawberries all over Northwest Arkansas. And obviously that was second to apple trees, which I'll talk about. I have a whole chapter about the apples. It was such a significant thing, but I just really enjoyed this picture. So, you know, I'm going to have a lot of old-fashioned recipes, ones you can't find anymore, including elderberry jelly, rosehip jelly, those sort of things. If you do go out collecting elderberries, my one tip is just don't stay and pick them one at a time. Just go ahead and take some shears and go ahead and cut off the whole branch when you're out there, because it'll take you till next season to pick all those tiny little elderberries off, but they sure are good. People used to make apple jelly, watermelon pickles. I actually have a recipe in here for watermelon pickles that just uses the rind, which is nice. At the end of 4th of July, you have the family over. Don't throw away the rind, just save it and pickle it later and you can eat it. Similar to orange or lemon rind, that sort of thing. I do have a story I would like to read you if anybody can handle a sad story. Is that okay? All right. It's probably my favorite story in the book. And I'll go ahead and open this up to an apple picture while I'm talking, just so you guys can try to imagine this story come to play. Let's see. Whoops. All right, here we go. All right, these are some of the apple pickers. That's probably there, and I think that's there in Rogers. Just apples everywhere, but apple jelly. So food has memories, as probably all of us know. So maybe I've awakened a few memories just talking about watermelon pickles, hominy, some of these foods that, you know, maybe you ate as a kid or you remember your grandmother making. I remember my grandmother making things like that and canning all the time. But it has good and sometimes bad memories. Almeda Riddle of Heber Springs remembers the fantastic tornado on Thanksgiving Day 1926 in this story about apple jelly. "I never open a jar of apple jelly that is clear and red and beautiful that I don't think of my husband, even though it's been over 45 years since his death. On that Thanksgiving morning, we had just finished breakfast, and the family had eaten up the last of a jar of apple jelly. My husband was sitting at the breakfast table holding our baby, we called him Cece, and he started pestering me to open up another jar of apple jelly. Well, I told him I wasn't gonna do it because there was just one jar left, and if I opened it, there wouldn't be any left for Christmas. He kept on and on a-pestering, and finally he started bouncing Cece on his knees saying, "Cece, tell your mama that she'll have apple jelly for the rest of her life, but she may not always have you and me." I told him they were trying to play on my sympathies, and I didn't have a bit of sympathy for them. But I got busy, and I fixed up some more hot biscuits, and I opened up that jar of apple jelly. Well, I can still see them sitting there, enjoying it, and the way that baby's face looked so happy over that apple jelly. And right after that, the tornado came that same day and took them away from me, and I have been so glad that the rest of my life I haven't had to live knowing that I hadn't opened that jar of apple jelly. Just really special. Things like that, like good or bad memories, I feel like food connects all of us, and it reminds us not just of the past but of the present. You know, when I think about a family, when I think about a culture, when I think about a people, I think about people gathering around a table, enjoying food and fellowship together. And I just wanted to read that because I just thought it is a sad story, but it's a very significant story. And every time I open a jar of apple jelly, I think about this story, you know, and I don't want to take it, we don't want to ever take it for granted when someone gives us a gift of jelly to know it can mean something like that to them. So it's just really significant. So I just wanted to share that for you guys. Now, of course, when you're canning and pickling, you know, you'll find lots of good, you might have a garden. You know, I have a great recipe in here from 1916 from the Niall cookbook. I remember going through the cookbook looking for what are some good pickling recipes, you know? Obviously people used to pickle a lot more, and what I found so significant when I went through this book with gloves, because I mean it literally was about to crumble in my hands, was that there were no markings, it was pristine, the pages weren't dog-eared, except for in the canning chapter. Let me tell you, that woman who, or man maybe, most likely a woman because they did a lot of the cooking, went to town in that chapter. She had markings and circled things. She even had taken a pair of scissors and cut out different recipes. And I thought, man, this cookbook meant so much to her, enough to cut out a recipe. And I found one that she hadn't cut out, but that she had starred and circled, and I put it in the book for y'all, and it's the end of the season pickles. And literally, it's at the end of the summer season, anything you've got left in the garden, you just pickle it on up, put it in a jar, and you're good to go. That way nothing gets wasted, because you wouldn't have wanted to waste anything during that time. So I just kind of think that's neat. Now, I have a little happy story for y'all, moving on to the next chapter, which is all about the wild things. Now, the wild things, obviously originally at one point were wild strawberries, but you know, as time went by, people really started to cultivate them in Arkansas, especially Northwest Arkansas did real well for growing strawberries. You can see this is a little tyke. He's just a perfect height for picking strawberries. And some of y'all, if you grew up around here, you might have remembered picking strawberries as a kid, I don't know, but it was a family affair. The whole community would come out for a 2 to 3 week period when the strawberries were there, and they would be picking. But you know, the other things you could pick would be blackberries, wild blueberries in the woods, possum grapes, things like that. Obviously the elderberries that would go in jelly, and persimmons, things like that. But one of my favorite stories, besides the one I just read, that I thought was just a hoot, and I didn't include all of it because it was just, it was long, but the way the man told it, I wanted to get the vernacular in there, because sometimes the way people tell stories is really something. This is about picking blueberries, and I got it out of a book called Garden Sass, which came out in the 70s. And it's talking about, well, my Aunt Nancy. She was going to go down where her husband was a-working, and she passed, and her and her husband, they were building a log cabin. Her husband had went off, I think his dogs had treed a squirrel or something, so he left her, and she thought she'd go down where he was working to go find that squirrel, and she went on walking down, she passed herself a blackberry patch. Well, the blackberries were ripe, so she gathered up her apron and she went to picking blackberries in her apron, gonna make a pie. And she was picking around there, and she heard a racket over close to her, and she looked up over there, and there was a black bear, about the size of a calf. And so, boy, she lit out. She hit the trail. Just love that way to say that. Anyways, as this woman is picking blackberries, she's running away from the bear, right? But she's like, oh, well, maybe I'll just drop a few blackberries and then he'll leave me alone. Well, that didn't work. The bear just kept following her. In fact, that enticed the bear to follow her all the way back to the cabin, where she scaled the walls because they hadn't put the roof on, they hadn't finished. She's climbing over the wood logs, and he's right after her. She gets inside the cabin, and she sees one of his paws go through the chinking, and she grabs herself an axe. And she grabbed up that axe, and as he stuck his feet through there, why, she just chopped one of his feet off. Well, that discouraged that bear right simple. You know, just funny. I mean, imagine what it would have been like to be an Ozark settler dealing with, when you go out to pick black bears, you might run into a bear or two. You know, you just never know, you know, that sort of thing. But it's just really interesting. You can go out and find wild greens, watercress, dandelion weed. Right now here that it's springtime, we'll probably start to see the morels popping up. You want to look for those in a sycamore grove, maybe on the north side of a hill. They like a lot of shade. If you ever go looking for wild morels, they are delicious. Taste just like a steak, and they're real small. And if you do pick morels, be sure you take a knife and cut them rather than yanking them out of the ground, so that more will come back the next spring. And you just want to tap them upside down and let all those little salt-sized seeds disperse, and you can plant you some more morels for next time. And just don't tell anybody where your secret spot is. You know, there's a lot of people in Northwest Arkansas that forage, and I don't have pictures on the screen to show you some of my color shots, but a lot of my friends, they do foraging in Bella Vista, and you can kind of see there's an arm that's just armed with morels. A lot of my friends really enjoy the woods and the wild mushrooms you can find, but you need a good field guide or to know what you're doing, because you don't want to eat the wrong ones. But that's one of the things that, you know, you'll find in the Ozark forest. Other rewards of this area, and probably also central Arkansas, of course, honey. You know, everybody needed a way to sweeten their food. I remember reading about tracking honeybees and how a farmer would trade a plowhead for a honeybee course, just to know how to find honeybees, to trade that sort of insider knowledge. And if you ever want to track honeybees the old-fashioned way, you just need to let out some sugar water and wait for a bee to come. And once a bee finds a sugar source, he will literally start to spiral around. And then as soon as he gets up to the right elevation, he will beeline straight back to the source of the hive. That's where the term beeline comes from, because it's a literal straight line. That's how a bee will always fly. All you have to do is just follow that bee. It's no problem. So farmers would often run into old tree stumps and cleared fields just trying to keep an eye on that bee and walking towards that hive. But once you found a hive, if you didn't completely rob the hive, it would support your family through the winter. And whenever you ran out of short sweetening or honey, you might turn to long sweetening, like sorghum, if you could grow it, which it grows about anywhere. This is a farmer there out in his sorghum fields. And then this is a person, let's see, let me get the right page here. It's a farmer out in the sorghum fields, but the clearing the sorghum is really a process in itself, and I talk about that in the pie and sweets chapter, because sorghum was such a valuable part of our history. They still do sorghum clearing out in Cane Hill. That's where the term Cane Hill comes from. Indians found sorghum cane grown on a hill. So there you go. So there he is gathering the sorghum cane. You're going to grind it through this kind of pump, and you've got mules going around, or horses, to cause the mechanism to turn. And it's really grinding out this green, almost neon green juice out of the sugar cane. That'll then get boiled down on a copper pan all day long. Community, everybody's involved in the raking and skimming off the scum. And eventually it gets boiled down to that black-like tar substance that you see that looks a lot like molasses. Sorghum is unfiltered often, and it's hard to find it nowadays, to find it unfiltered in a store. But, you know, if you know somebody that does that, you know, it's a good time to buy it. A little bit of sorghum will last you a long time, which is why they used to call sorghum long sweetening, because it would last a lot longer once your honey supply ran out. Because most of the time, Arkansans might, at the early stages, not have been able to afford white sugar. So honey and sorghum would be the way you did your sweetening. So I love a little sorghum with just a little bit of butter and salt. You soften the butter and you put that on cornbread. It is good. We have a great restaurant up our way in Bentonville called the Hive. It's at 21C Art Hotel, which is a new modern hotel that's opened up in our area. And that's what they serve their cornbread with, and I just started doing that myself. I just love it. So, you know, we've got a lot of restaurants like the Hive, and even the Crystal Bridges restaurant, which is called 11. That is, you know, some of our restaurants up in Northwest Arkansas are bringing back Ozark high South cuisine, but they're using the ingredients like sorghum or, you know, wild game or fish. You know, just using the ingredients but in new and inventive and gourmet ways. And so I noticed that right away, just coming back, that I've seen a lot of things evolve. You know, if you think about the fishing and game culture in Northwest Arkansas, man, we've got it. We had the White River. Here's a woman, maybe the same woman that had the shotgun earlier, wading in the river, doing some fishing, trying to probably catch some trout. Even the White River, this is kind of a big picture, but you can see the scope of this. This was a postcard probably from about, I'd say maybe back in the 40s and 50s. People would come over just for fishing vacations to Northwest Arkansas and fish on the White River. So they would set up fishing camps. And so you can just see the huge bluff line above this little boy, and he's caught himself a fish. You know, the trout is wonderful. In fact, some of the recipes I have in there that are some of my favorite wild game recipes in the book, I have a whole chapter on game and fish, and really, you know, we're good, okay, is the trout, the smoked trout. And you can actually smoke a trout in your oven. You don't have to own a smoker. I used a Dutch oven when I was teaching a cooking class. I grabbed a big Dutch oven that was big enough, almost like a turkey baster, you know, the big turkey roasting pan with the lid, and set in a foil tray, and I put my smoked trout, my trout raw in there, fillet to fillet, and put some lemon slices between it, and you follow the recipe. I've got it in here. It's real easy. Then I put some wood chips in the base of the Dutch oven, and I covered it so it kind of was elevated inside the Dutch oven from the floor of it. Put a little water in there, and you smoke it. I mean, you cook it at 250 degrees for a little while, but it really establishes the same mechanism if you don't have a smoker to smoke it in your own home oven. So just wanted a little tip. I kind of figured it out, and I found out later that Rachel Ray had discovered it too, and I was like, man, we should get together, you know, me and her. I just came up with it on my own. I didn't get any ideas from anybody. I just thought it would work. So, you know, sometimes chefs, we think alike, you know. But if you look back at food, you're going to look at a time period when people would, you know, like I said, trade a plowhead for a bee course. They would move to an area, and I might just talk a few more minutes because I wanted to share these things with y'all. They would move to an area, and sometimes they would even buy into a hog claim. Has anyone ever heard of that? So a hog claim in Northwest Arkansas, you would move there to the Ozarks, and you and your neighbors, you would pitch in on a hog claim. That way when somebody did kill one of the family hogs, everybody would be involved, but you'd get a share of the meat. And then when you killed one of your hogs, everybody would come and help you because it's a big process and it's kind of messy. And so that way you always had fresh meat on the table, which is really nice. Just by volunteering to always help your neighbors every time you need to scald a hog and cut it up into parts. You know, it's a little bit of a bloody business, but I remember interviewing a lot of folks that remember hog killing time. It's their favorite time of the year. It's always got to be real cold in the fall, and everybody kind of get involved, and you just share the different parts of the hog. But that was kind of a big deal, and obviously besides wild hog, which were known as Razorbacks at the time, thus our mascot, Go U of A, we also had squirrel. I love this picture. Obviously these young boys have shot them some squirrels, and everybody's really proud about it. I always hear people talking about the California Atkins diet and how to eat healthy these days and eat all organic and shop at Whole Foods, and I go, well, you could also just shoot some squirrels because they're organic. They're free range. There's no pesticides or hormones in that meat. And, you know, we always called it the free range tree chicken, you know. But up in Northwest Arkansas, we have a big enough squirrel hunting population that a local friend of mine and resident, he has started the World Championship Squirrel Cook-Off. So if you're ever up our way in September, you should come up to that. It's free. It's in Bentonville. And they literally have people from all over the country compete in squirrel recipes, and one of the recipes did end up in the book, and it kind of helped with the subtitle about squirrel meatloaf. Of course, there's lots of good recipes that are a little bit more palatable for your everyday person. You don't have to just eat squirrel. If you like fried chicken, it's in here, and good biscuits and gravy and that sort of thing. But the squirrel meatloaf won the 2014 World Championship, so I wanted to put it in there. My friends would let me borrow it, and it just really is pretty special. And the last thing I just wanted to tell you about food-wise, besides fish and game and squirrel, are apples. So obviously, from the 1890s to the 1920s, the Ozarks supplied most of the nation's apples. We would ship them all around in boxcars because we had the Arkansas Black and a lot of other varietals that could withstand heavy shipping, the heavy movement. They wouldn't bruise easily, and they would last 3 to 6 months after they were picked, if kept in the right conditions. So that way a kid could have an apple for Christmas, or you could eat an apple in March that we shipped off in September. Just incredible before the days of refrigeration and that sort of thing to be able to have apples that could do that. So we became the nation's supplier of apples for quite some time. There were apple orchards all over Northwest Arkansas. This one's here in Rogers. But with the 1920s came an apple blight that wiped out, and a lot of farmers didn't really necessarily know much about grafting and taking care of apples. It was just a cash crop. Then with the Great Depression, that sort of sealed the deal. So people pulled out their apple orchards, put in chicken farms eventually, and that's how we became known as kind of a chicken capital with Tyson and Simmons, and and George's Poultry up that way, but originally there were apple orchards everywhere. We're trying to bring them back, and we just opened our first cidery, which I talk about with an interview of this first cidery owner, Leo Orpin, about Arkansas is now making their own Arkansas cider again, which is really great. It's a great way to use apples. And so if you do come to visit Northwest Arkansas, you'll start to notice that there is more of a scene, even in our local bars and restaurants, where you can get cider on tap that's been made in Northwest Arkansas. But the future of our cuisine, I think, is really positive, optimistic. We've got a lot of restaurants that are developing Ozark cuisine and adding it on the menu. I always try to encourage people, if you want to see more local produce and you want to support local farmers, you have to ask your restaurants to buy from the local farmers, and we have to make a supply chain where it's possible. So that is kind of our next step in Northwest Arkansas and the Ozarks, of keeping that alive. You know, helping people to realize that good food can come from our little state. And we should always ask for it. We should always cherish what we eat and really appreciate it. Whether it's a jar of apple jelly or a piece of squirrel meatloaf or just a good piece of fried chicken, it all kind of goes back to our heritage, and that's why I wrote this book. So we wouldn't lose that heritage, so we could preserve it, and so we could ensure that future generations will know what Arkansas is all about. So that's the rest of my speech, but I just wanted to ask you guys if you have any questions. Thank you.